Good evening. My name is Dr. Rebecca Harkins-Cross. I'm a lecturer in the creative writing program here at RMIT University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Capital for tonight's very special event, presented in partnership by RMIT University, the Wheeler Centre and the Melbourne Writers' Festival. On behalf of us all here tonight and RMIT University, I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands we are gathered, and respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders, past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be with us in the audience tonight. RMIT is proud to be working with the Melbourne Writers' Festival and our longtime partner, the Wheeler Centre, to present tonight's event with Colm Tóibín as he reflects on his extraordinary career and, of course, his latest novel, Long Island. RMIT regularly collaborates with the Wheeler Centre to present exciting conversations like this one, which represent both organisations' shared values of celebrating and showcasing emerging and established voices and delivering cultural public programming inspired by writing and ideas. Please join me in welcoming our guests to the stage. Former regular panellist on ABC TV's The Book Club and books editor of The Age for 25 years, Jason Steger, and of course, award-winning author and current laureate for Irish fiction, Colm Tóibín.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this very special evening with Colm Tóibín. And Colm, welcome to this special evening with hundreds of your enthusiastic readers. Before we start, could I ask you please to turn your phones onto silent? You'll get a chance to ask questions of Colm later on via the Slido QR code, which will appear on the screen behind you. Copies of Colm's books will be available from readings in the foyer, and he'll be very happy, I expect, to sign them in the salon upstairs. Colm, as you all no doubt know, is novelist, critic, essayist, playwright, story writer, and poet. His many books include The South, which was published 35 years ago, your first novel, The Heather Blazing, which he brought to the Melbourne Writers' Festival on his first visit to Australia. That was in 1993. And other books include The Story of the Night, The Blackwater Lightship, The Master, Brooklyn, Nora Webster, The Guest at the Feast, New Ways to Kill Your Mother, Love in a Dark Time, The Magician, and last year, Long Island. He's been shortlisted for the Booker on 3 occasions, was for 2 years the laureate for Irish fiction, which I think he's just finished that office. He's a professor of humanities at Columbia University in New York, writes regularly for the London Review of Books, had another short story in the New Yorker a few weeks ago, and seems to me to be astonishingly busy, even though, as he confessed to the Fin Review recently, he spends a lot of time in the hammock in his Los Angeles garden, where he lives much of the time. In Los Angeles, that is, not in the garden. But I never expected to be talking to Colm about a sequel to Brooklyn, 15 years after that novel was published. Brooklyn, as you will recall, told the story of Eilis Lacey, who leaves Ireland in the 50s for a job in New York. There she falls for Tony Fiorello, whom she secretly marries shortly before returning home because of the death of her beloved sister Rose. Back in Ireland, she begins some sort of romance with the son of the local publican, Jim Farrell, and that causes her to question her stateside commitments. Fast forward over 20 years in Long Island, and Eilish and Tony now have 2 children, Larry and Rosella, and are living on the eponymous island where Tony had long aspired to a home. As the book opens, an irate Irishman knocks on the door to tell Eilish that Tony has made his wife pregnant, and when the baby arrives, he will be dumping it on her. This prompts her to go back back to Ireland for the first time since the events of Brooklyn, back to Enniscorthy, where she will again encounter Jim, now running the pub, who has been in a discreet relationship with Eilis's best friend Nancy, now widowed. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Colm Tóibín. Thank you. Colm, as I said, I was very surprised by the appearance of a sequel to Brooklyn. And given that you've spoken in the past about a particular pact between writer and reader that suggests that the writer shouldn't close everything off, I just wondered what prompted you to return to the characters 15 years on?
I'm not sure I'm proud of this. I think in general, sequels, I mean, I think in the film industry, Gladiator 9, that is not a good look, and if you've written a novel, if you've written 10 novels and one of them has been commercially successful, why is that the one you want to write a sequel to? Like, are you broke? Like, are you shameless? So I think there is a pact between writer and reader in a novel that this is the novel and that this novel is shaped. And it's shaped, it's not a line, it's an arc. In other words, it has a rhythm of its own. It has a way of reaching a moment where it begins to move down and out towards completion. As well as conclusion, but more completion, that something has been told, something has been finished. And there may be ways of doing an ending and leaving it open, but that's not to leave it open for a further book. I think if you want to say that to the reader, you've got to say, well, the further book is part 2 of this book. In other words, it's here, it's for you now. But to wait all these years later and then dump another book on the unsuspecting public is a bit rich. And the only excuse I have is that it occurred to me. And once it occurred to me, it stayed in my mind. And the S word, the sequel word, I didn't use it once to myself. I didn't tell anyone I'm writing a sequel. It was only when it got into the publishers, I was going to say bony hands, that they started to use the S word so, unashamedly. And even the Americans decided to put it as part of the Eilis Lacey saga that's going to go on seemingly as long as Harry Potter did. And I didn't know what to do when I saw that. I just thought I'd smile and just, the marketing department went nuts. And what am I going to do? Like go in and have a meeting with them or something? And so the idea occurred to me. And it occurred to me partly from reading, teaching a lot of the 19th century novels about the idea of plot. And I have a fellow teaching with me 2 doors down who's called Ed Mendelsohn. And these people are really smart and they all have PhDs and I don't have a PhD. And I often feel the lack, and they often look at me, I think, as though I shouldn't be there. I should be teaching in creative writing or something. And but anyway, I put these novels on the course, and one of them was The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. And it really is something where it opens in the 1830s when a man walks into a town with his wife and his daughter. And there's a country fair on, and sort of auctions are happening, and people are selling things. And he has a lot to drink, this man. And towards the end of the day, he puts his wife up for sale. And he puts her up on a block and says, "Who will buy this woman?" And over to the side, there's a dark stranger. And eventually he puts up, "I'll buy her." And at the end of the chapter that evening, that dark stranger, the wife and the daughter, walk out of that town, leaving the drunken husband behind. Now, no matter what you do, this is an action that will have consequences. And Ed Mendelsohn's definition in his book, Moral Agents, it's a book on the novel, his definition of plot. What is a plot? A plot is an action that has consequences, that dictates consequences or creates space for consequences. Consequences that are not exact or predictable, but at least are plausible. And that it's the consequences matter more than as much as the original action. So I read this, and I thought of the Thomas Hardy, and I thought, is it possible now to write a novel with a plot that isn't a detective novel, that doesn't have someone being stabbed, and was it the butler or was it the priest? Or was it, was it his mother or something? Is there a story still to be told in which every single paragraph is leading you towards a further examination of the consequences. And so in the Mayor Casterbridge, you could go 100 pages without any mention of what had occurred at that fair, but you always know this is going to come back in. And so too, this Irishman who arrives. He's Irish because I can't write American dialogue. So I wanted him to make him an American, but I couldn't think how white guys in America talk, least of all African Americans or people from Central America. I just don't have this clue in anger what an American would say, what he would call her. So I had to make him Irish because I knew what he would say. And once that opening of the book that you've described, where he comes about the baby, I have a problem because it's too much, it's too melodramatic. It's just shockingly, I suppose, garish, loud. And no one wants loud Irishmen in books anymore. And so the next 8 pages are her alone. Eilis is alone. She's in her 40s. She's shocked, but she doesn't speak. She doesn't cry. She doesn't do anything. So I need her solitude to be the thing that matters. And so these things began to interest me, and the pandemic was on, and I had nothing whatsoever to do. And, you could talk, I'll try anything. And so I started to write this. And so that's my only excuse. That just came into my mind as I've described, the ingredients, and there were other ingredients too, just things I was thinking about. But mainly the idea that once this happens to her, she's alone in America. The idea that somehow she's made a life for herself in America. The way people talk about that, oh, she made a life for herself in America. Well, she didn't, because when this shock comes, she has nobody to talk to. That,
she's, she's completely on her own.
Completely alone. And once that's happened, then I can find ways then. And I realized that, if this is 1976, her mother could be still alive. And not only that, but pray to God that Jim Farrell still isn't married. And try and find a plausible reason why Jim Farrell is still a bachelor. And so this was all in my mind without thinking about that I was going to have to go to Melbourne and I was going to have to make apologize. It's not that you accuse me of anything, but I accuse myself quite rightly of fatal cheapness and shameless.
But it is an essentially plot-driven opening, isn't it? In the same way that in Brooklyn, when I read Brooklyn, you get very much towards the end, 6 or 7 pages, and you don't know what you're going to do. You don't know what Eilis is going to do, and I remember reading it and thinking, I don't know how Colm is going to get out of this. But then you did have a wonderful figure called Nettles Kelly who...
Nettles helped, yeah.
Nettles helped a lot.
Yeah.
But so, you go back to the characters, but had Eilis, had you thought about her over the 15 years? You know how some writers say, I've written this character, book's finished, dead to me now. Did Eilis linger for you?
Yes, something happened in the meantime, which is that they made a film of the book. And I suppose the problem in a way was that I liked the people who made the film and I liked the film. And therefore I ended up doing a lot of events around the film. Just, there's an interesting moment where there's a university in America called Notre Dame. It's a very Catholic university. It doesn't like queers. And so therefore having me to speak is it would be a very big issue. There'd be a lot of meetings among the priests to see, is there any way we can get him without him causing any grief, like talking about being a queer? And so they realized they could show Brooklyn, because they don't like being left out of things. So they likes of every writer, especially Irish writers, there at some point, and they pay you loads of money to bring you into South Bend or somewhere. And so they could show the film Brooklyn, which is really sweet, and have me talk about it being really sweet. And therefore, I ended up then watching it on those occasions and other ones. So I saw it over a short period of time, maybe 6 or 7 times. And of course, the emotion comes back to you no matter what you do. You're in the cinema watching it, this much more immediate form, with actors interpreting the thing as best they can to be faithful to the notion of character. And in the middle of all this came the Irish actor Donald Gleeson, That's D-O-M-H-N-A-L-L, Donald Gleeson. And I knew Donald's father, Brendan Gleeson, was an actor. And Donald, you see, I was really having it in for Irish film, Irish plays, Irish novels that had these Irishmen who made too much noise and were brooding or were drunk or were violent.
There are a lot of them.
You know, you have a film, Robert, a film called The Irishman. It's Scorsese, The Irishman. There's no chance he's going to be sitting at home watching Netflix. He's going to be out there with the mafia, out there with the IRA, out there with his charm, which is even worse. And there's going to be films about Irishmen cutting their fingers off. Or there was too much brooding and too much violence. I thought, is there any chance we could ever have an ordinary Irishman? And Donald gave me the clue, because in the film of Brooklyn, there's a scene added, which he asked, if I want to make this character work, can you give me one more scene? And there's one scene written where Jim talks about that he'd never been anywhere. He'd never been in Rome, he'd never been in America, never been in London. He just talks in such a way about himself. So you realize, this is what's called a nice guy. This is a tolerant, easygoing, stable person. He won't be any different when he's drunk. Watch a smiler. Watch an Irish smiler when they're drunk. And so I got a lot of energy from this performance, because I thought he had managed to give Jim a sort of glow while being faithful to the idea that Jim was not an exceptional person, that he was a good man. And from that, it gave me that I could make Jim in Long Island much more present, and I could give Jim a thing that I think you have to give a character in a novel that I hadn't given him in Brooklyn, because Brooklyn is told only from Eilish's perspective. I gave him solitude. Yeah. That every evening when the pub closes, he goes upstairs to the house, the living quarters above the pub, and he's alone. It isn't that he's alone in any dreadful way, but just he has an hour or two before he goes to bed, where he often just has a gin and tonic and sits there and thinks about things. But that gave me that I could give him all of this. But I'm not sure I would have done the book if the emotion of the first book hadn't come back to me, not as rereading it, but as the film.
As the film.
Yeah.
But I mean, does that mean when you're writing Long Island, does that mean you see Saoirse Ronan and Donald Gleeson, when you're thinking about your characters?
Yeah, I didn't see Saoirse so much, because I thought her performance was so exceptional that there was nothing I could use, that she had been faithful to the thing in a certain way, and also because, of course, she was the protagonist of Brooklyn. She was at the very center of the book. I couldn't move her any closer to a center. But when I was thinking about what Jim Farrell looks like, I suppose I was thinking about Donald. And Jim certainly has red hair, and he's probably a bit taller than Donald, but not much. And I had a sense of, but more than, of the performance, having just enriched what I was doing, I think. Yeah.
And when you came to write Long Island, I mean, you had to give Nancy, the three main characters, Nancy, Eilish, and Jim, their points of view. I mean, in Long Island, in Brooklyn, it's mainly Eilish's point of view.
Only Eilish. Yeah.
But you had to decide to give them voices, internal voices.
Yeah, because the novel Long Island is filled with secrets. In other words, it depends on what the reader knows everything. And then there are things that Eilish doesn't know, that Jim does, and it depends on not knowing. The drama does. And therefore, it can't be told only from one perspective, because then you can't really work out what the not knowing, if Eilish doesn't know something and it's told from her perspective, how are you ever going to let the reader know it? Unless the author is going to come in saying, well, there was one moment where she didn't understand. And no one wants the author in that book, sort of novel. So therefore, I worked out, once the first section is over and the whole Irishman with the whole baby stuff and do the American stuff, then she goes home. What I want to do is blank, stop, and bring it into Nancy's perspective. And as Nancy, her best friend in Enniscorthy in Ireland, is thinking about things and having her day, a knock comes to the door. It's a second knock. Earlier it's been the Irishman with the baby. This time it's Eilish home from America. So you see her as she doesn't see herself, as glamorous, as having just looking great. She doesn't think like that about herself. And yet that's all Nancy sees. And Nancy makes a terrible mistake. She invites her to her daughter's wedding. If only she didn't do that. Just on a sort of Chardonnay rush with no Chardonnay, she just, and the excitement of seeing her, said, oh, great, you'll be here for the wedding. Wedding. And afterwards she realizes, oh, and of course, I'm working with an idea, I think, out of a folktale now. If there's a wedding and a stranger comes into the wedding, someone that people really don't know, this is havoc, this is disruption of a communal ritual by someone, like not exactly the wicked witch, but somebody who can cast a spell on one person at the wedding. So you're back in the sort of business of almost Irish folktale of a stranger came to a wedding.
And of course, Eilis has changed a lot. When she comes to the wedding, and yes, she has this effect, but when she's back in Enniscorthy, everybody is sort of put on their guard because she's been in America, because she has changed in some sort of intangible way.
Yeah, I mean, people just presume that she has dollars. And she just about does, but when Jim eventually says to her, of course, you must have stayed in some wonderful American hotels. He doesn't understand. She's never stayed in a hotel in her life. Her life in America has not been like that. But I think that whole idea, it's certainly true with Ireland, that in Christmas week every year, 1 million people, in a country of about 4.5 million people, which is the Republic of Ireland, 1 million people come back into Ireland for Christmas. So it's big news. I mean, honestly, the news goes out of the airport and you have, weeping parents and joy and all the business of Christmas songs. You have all these people coming. But I know something about that because I have a friend who's a psychiatrist and he says that they begin to arrive looking for desperate help on about the 27th of December, when Christmas is over and the dark days are there and you've come home all the way from Australia, New Zealand or San Francisco, and you don't want to be back in your old bedroom, and you don't want your mother saying the same thing to you every morning. Would you never think of getting married? Or would you never think of getting your hair cut? Or would you never think there'd be a lovely job for your home? They're looking for teachers down the road, And you say, if she says it one more, and you begin then, your brother-in-law brings you out drinking and says all sorts of things to you about your family, and then you drink 5 pints too many, and you go back to someone's house you don't like in the town, you drink brandy, which is always a mistake, and then you're 2 days, like feeling, and your mother says, are you all right? What happened the other night? And you just wish, and slowly, if you're under any pressure already, pressures of mental health, you actually, by the 28th, they're looking for help. And they want to have you, I was going to say, they want to lock you up. Say, he's not well. You'll have to know, no, we can't look after him at all now. And my psychiatrist said, you have no idea what it was like for the mental services. So I'm doing a mild version of that homecoming, where you're back, 20 years later, she realizes, she's the same mattress.
Yeah.
Mattress.
She makes that
and
point.
The one thing you can't do, of course, is go down in the morning and say, would you ever think of changing that mattress? Because that would be so insulting. But on a piece of jet lag, she decides her mother does need a fridge. And she buys her one without asking. And in my family, I don't know about if anyone here is Irish, but if you are, you know this, where Irish people saw electricity bills as a form of colonial intrusion. In other words, it would come, I think it came every 2 months. And my mother would say, look at this now. That electric fire eats electricity. And then every time you want to put it on, because there was no other heat in one of the rooms, she'd say, 1 bar is enough for that electric fire. It eats electricity. Like you're home from, you're home from Spain and you just think, why did I come here if I'm eating electricity?
It's like in Australia now, actually.
Yeah,
the bills.
And the battle over the tumble dryer. Yeah. I don't know if you had tumble dryers here, but it was a way of drying clothes in a country where it rains all the time, so it's essential. My mother would come again and touch it and say, has someone been using the tumble dryer? And my sisters, and oh, jeez, it would be such a fun. And so all that stuff about coming home to Enniscorthy, and of course, if you wanted to talk about where you'd been. In other words, the mother has no interest in America.
No.
So don't tell me all about that now. And I was in Spain for ages, and I thought they'd want to know something. Like Franco had died, for example. Not a hope.
But I mean, you talked a bit about the restraint, the emotional restraint in the book, and secrets. There's also something that they all do. There's a lot of scheming, isn't there?
Yeah.
And perhaps the best. Well, I don't want to give. I'm not sure about spoilers here.
No, let's not.
But there's a lot of good scheming that goes on.
Yeah, I mean, the whole point is a conspiracy of secrecy. In other words, that Nancy and Jim know something that Eilish doesn't know. Slowly, Eilish and Jim know something that Nancy doesn't know. And they have to keep the secrets. And what's interesting about a small town like that, and I think you know this if you're gay more than if you're straight maybe, you can have, things going on late at night around the town without anyone knowing. People don't, oddly enough, notice everything. And so the whole point is that who controls the night, and who therefore controls the sort of secrets. I mean, Eilish doesn't tell her mother, and some of the secrets are there for really good reasons. Eilish comes out from America, and she's had this trouble with her husband. And she doesn't want to tell her mother because she just doesn't want her mother going on about it all the time. So she keeps that secret from her mother. And this is 1976, in which getting engaged was almost more important than getting married. And people would get engaged on New Year's Eve. And then there'd be a ring. And then my Auntie Harriet got engaged, and she had a big ring, and she'd just do this to people. Look, my ring. And, and people had secret engagements, and they got engaged before Christmas, but they didn't want to tell anyone. And this died out soon afterwards. People got sense, but this idea that if Nancy's daughter gets engaged on New Year's Eve, her mother, Nancy, cannot suddenly announce, I'm engaged too. Because everyone in the town would say, well, just see that Nancy couldn't let her daughter have a nice engagement without her getting engaged too. And so Nancy and Jim have to keep their engagement a secret, which is absolutely essential for the plot of the book. If they don't do that, the book can't happen. I have to go around for ages trying to work out, is there any reason for them to keep their engagement a secret? And then I come up with the idea of Nancy's daughter, and that people wouldn't, the mother wouldn't announce her engagement until the daughter was married. And that would be called good manners.
That would be called what?
It'd be called good manners.
But so, when you were, is it right that when you were 12, you actually picked up the idea of Brooklyn, this story? And were you then, I know that's very shortly after your father died, were you then a reader? Were you thinking of writing even at that young age?
No.
But you just picked up the story and kept it.
See, my father died in the summer of 67, and I'm 12. And what happens in the town is that between then and Christmas, for that season, people will call to the house every evening. The agreement is that my mother will somehow never be left alone for a whole evening. And all sorts of people come. Some people come very often, relatives come, but then a lot of other people come just once. And it's just a normal part of life in the town. And of course, it was tremendously interesting. And my job was to answer the door, take coats if necessary, and bring people into the back room where my mother was. And then you would sit around and listen. I mean, none of the conversation was ever sort of scandalous in any way, but there was an awful lot of talk. Because they said to my mother, I'm sorry for your trouble, and there'd be very short condolence. And then they would just change the subject and distract the company. And people would tell all sorts of things. And it was all very interesting. And I could take you through, if I went to a thing in the town now, and some of those people were there, I could tell you something about each of them. And some of it would be very interesting. And one evening, a woman came, and she'd never been in the house before. I would have thought her was an old woman. And I took her coat and her hat, and she had a handbag, and she was rummaging in the handbag for letters. And it may have been that the letters were from Brooklyn, her daughter, but not America and not Manhattan and not New York, Brooklyn. Oh, she said Brooklyn and Brooklyn. And it'd be Brooklyn, and I was in Brooklyn. And then what was what was often very interesting was if someone left, I thought it was always a mistake for people to leave. They should all leave en masse, because if one person left, someone would be bound to say, do you know something about her? I said, what? That woman's daughter came home once from America, from Brooklyn. And on the way over on the boat, she took a ring off because she had got married just before she came home, because there was a fellow in New York who was so crazy about her that he wouldn't let her go home. Wouldn't let her go home unless she married him. And then she didn't want to tell them at home she was married, because that would mean she would have to go back, and she wasn't home for good. She didn't tell them for a while, and then one evening she told them. Now, whatever that story was, whatever the shape of it was, I remembered it. I would see the woman on the street, the mother, and I did nothing more with it until about 40 years later. I was writing the novel Nora Webster, which is really about my mother in those years in the house, in those few years after my father died. And I was I wanted a detail of the sort of conversations that were happening in that room. And I put in that little story about the woman and her daughter. And I was reading that over, that first chapter of that novel, and I saw the story, and I'd just been in America, and I'd been homesick. I'd been living in Texas, and I missed Ireland of all places. I mean, I missed Irish food and Irish people. Things I don't like, Irish weather, just a general Irish news. And so I was homesick. And so when I came back and saw those few sentences, they're still there in Nora Webster, whatever it was, I thought, I'm going to stop writing this book. I'm going to write this. But I didn't know at the beginning whether it was a short story or what shape it would be, except it was the story of someone going from Enniscorthy to Brooklyn, meeting someone there, him falling in love with him and marrying him without thinking of the consequences, and coming home and not telling her she was married. So I wrote that, and that became the novel Brooklyn. And then I was signing books in New York soon afterwards when Brooklyn came out, and a woman came, and I signed a book, and she just very quietly, politely said, I think that's my mother. And I said, did your mother, she was Irish and married an Italian? Because that had come up a few times. And she said, no, I actually think that's my mother. And I said, where was your mother from? And she said, oh, where you're from, Enniscorthy. And I said, and what was your mother's name?
Oops.
And she said her name, and I said, yeah, your grandmother came to our house in 1967, probably in October or into November, and she told that story. And she said, but, she was puzzled because why did you make him Italian? I said, well, because I didn't know anything other than the bare outline. I didn't even know what time of the year it was. I made it the summer because you can't write a winter novel in Ireland, unless it's about, solitude and electric fires and tumble dryers. For anything to work, it has to be June or July into August. And, really. And I didn't know anything. And she said, that he was an Irish cop, the policeman. And I almost felt regret. I wish I'd known that, because I would have loved to have written all about the police in New York and stuff. And it would have been a different novel, I think. But in any case, that's how the story started.
Did you, when this woman came up and said, were you nervous? Did you?
She was so nice.
Yeah.
And
did you write a special inscription in the book?
No, I know we keep in touch. And herself and her sister came to the launch of the film Brooklyn in Enniscorthy years later. No, it was not like that. It was not that you've stolen our lives or appropriation or who do you think you are. It was it was just an interesting fact that
I mean, one of the great things about the books, the books that are set around Enniscorthy, is the way that they sort of talk to each other, don't they? You're talking about Nora Webster. Well, that's Mrs. Lacey who comes to pay her respects to Nora at the very beginning of the book. And then, when in Long Island, when Eilis walks past the judge's house, that's from Heather Blazing. And so there's it refers back to the house that Nora sold after her husband died. It's a wonderful picture of a town and a group of group of characters.
Yeah.
And when you wrote, I mean, and in Long Island, there's Dora Devra, plays a very, very important but small part, and she is the mother of Lily from Blackwater Lightship. When you couldn't have envisaged writing this sort of group of novels when you wrote The Heather Blazing?
No, it comes book by book. You add. It's a pity I didn't know about the later books when I wrote the first one, because I put them all in there. But I was in China, minding my own business, and I was doing an event, and a student, a PhD student, a young woman, stood up and said, you have used one character from one novel in another novel as a smaller character by the same name, as though it was maybe perhaps an illegal act of sort of self-piracy. And yeah, that it's a lovely idea, you know, that you're writing another Enniscorthy novel and you realize you can bring the ghost. But there's one moment where Nancy is really trying to lose weight and she's going for this big walk and she meets Nora Webster and her sister. It was lovely. I mean, I wanted her to meet someone. But when I hadn't put in Nora Webster from the earlier book, I just thought it was like bringing in a ghost, bringing in someone you've lost and letting her in for a little bit. But there's an element of mischief, there's an element of playfulness, but actually it becomes quite emotionally important. Just let the character in a bit again. I was going to say that James, then I realized don't say this, but that James Joyce does it a lot in Ulysses, where characters from Dubliners, minor characters, Nosey Flynn and all sorts of people, Kathleen Carney, all just names often mentioned once in Dubliners, appear later in Ulysses. Yeah. And it's a lovely idea, just as the reader, you just go, oh my God, I know who Kathleen Carney, that's the same Kathleen Carney, you know.
Yep. I mean, that whole, the town of Enniscorthy is clearly essential to the work. The other thing is the coast. In A Guest at the Feast, you write this about the coast of County Wexford, and it's about when you were writing your first novel, The South. You said, I found I could conjure it up. This is the coast. I found I could conjure it up without any difficulty. It almost came of its own accord, summoned by something I was not fully conscious of. And then you go on, I wrote about it again in The Heather Blazing, and again in the Blackwater Lightship, and again in Brooklyn. It's also conjured up in a number of short stories. Can you tell us a bit about your relationship with the landscape around Enniscorthy, around К𝐭𝐲?
Yeah, I was brought up in the town, and we're from the town in the sense that my four grandparents were born. It's a small town. We're born in the town, and my father was a teacher, and my sisters were teachers. So we have a whole sort of connection with the town. It's very close. And but for me, a lot of the time was misery. You know, going to school and being bullied by teachers and awful people. And so, because my father was a teacher, and because things were very cheap, you could rent a hut or a tiny house on that coast for very little money, and you could go for a long time because we had long holidays. And my mother loved the sun, even the Irish sun. And if there was the slightest pale chance of the sun coming out, she'd have us all out on the strand and going into the sea. And in retrospect, it was really wonderful. And in retrospect, also just the sheer beauty of the thing. It's very pale light, and it's not stony. There are no rocks. It's not the west of Ireland. It's East Coast Ireland, meaning sand, maybe a few pebbles is the nearest thing, and an eroding coastline. And there was one particular place we went to every summer, renting a house there. And when after my father died, we never, ever went back there. I mean, it was just that we simply never went back there. And that then, for me, took on a special, I suppose, glow that I could see it clearly. It was fully lost. It was locked in time. I could see its beginning date and its end date. And I built a small house. I got a plot of land and built a small house there. And I have to say, to the consternation of some of the family, say, why are you going back there? Of all places, you know, like you go to Marbella, you know, you go to, you know, and you go to Paris, but why would you want it? And of course, I wanted to go there for a really good reason, not just about writing, but just about being able to have it back in some way. The place where we went until I was 12. And then it began to appear, in the books. Oh, and it's coming more. I've got bad news. And in a way, it's hard to write a book without bringing, one of the Wexford books, without bringing the characters there. So it's an actually crucial scene where towards the end of the book, where in Long Island. And it's just me again, just like, is there any way I can get this into the book? And it's like having some cranky old mother or grandmother, you know, I need her now. And then I need to go bring someone to that. It's not called beach, it's called strand, the strand in Cush. And just have something happen there. And have seabirds and have a eroding cliff. You think you could, surely you think you could only do that once. One of the great things is that a lot of people don't read all your books. So you could try it again as though you've never done it before and see if, unlike the Chinese PhD student, see if you could get away with it, you know.
You like your characters to have a swim though, don't you?
Yeah, you see the big drama, the biggest drama of your life all summer was the sea was cold. And it was really like, it wasn't ice cold, but it was cold. But the rule was all children must get into the sea now. And then we'd all go shivering. And then the word was called getting down. It sounds odd now, but are you down yet? Meaning, have you actually gone and submerged yourself in the water? Because once you did that, then you were fine, you could swim around. But doing it first was such a shock. And so a whole part of my childhood was spent standing up to my knees and then a bit higher. As each wave would come, you'd jump and flinch and cringe. And so I always have characters doing that, yeah.
Now, I must just, ladies and gentlemen, if you're going to ask a question, you must, there you go, that must be the QR code for Slido.
Slido.
Colm's a big fan of Slido.
I've just discovered this new thing. I'm going to go back to Ireland and tell everybody, in Australia, what's the news in Australia? Slido.
And I am a Slido virgin, so we'll find out, we'll see what happens. But if you want to ask a question, you have to do it via Slido. Now, Colm, back in 1993, when I interviewed you for The Age, it's terrible.
We were young then, weren't we?
We were in our 30s then. Colm, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, Colm is going to be 70 next week.
When are you going to be 70?
Start of next year. So yeah, I'm just a young stripling compared with you.
Yeah.
But
is it the knees or the hips? Which?
So, but back in 1993, you told me that writing should be a cathartic experience, and you said, "quote: You should be a much looser and humane human being after a book than before it." So you've written many books since then. You must be very loose and very humane now.
I think that after I spoke to you in 1993, I finally found a therapist. And I got put through the most severe and serious amounts of heavy-duty, really heavy-duty therapy. And so that I learned, if you want catharsis, don't write a novel to get it. It would be a really stupid thing to do. In other words, that it isn't as though by exploring dark, difficult things such as loss or grief, that by exploring them in a novel, you're almost exploiting them as much as you're exploring them. And you're almost solidifying things that were not solid before. And I'm not sure it helps you in any way, except maybe to recognize that there's themes coming up over and over in novels. And I think it was in Adelaide some years later, maybe good long time later, that a woman, again getting a book signed, turned to me as I had signed it and said, I'm not gonna imitate an Australian accent, I'm just not. And she said, how many people die in this one? And I had to say, quite a number. And that's the change in Long Island.
Yeah.
No one in Long Island dies. There's of the 11 novels, and I didn't know that when I was working, but it's the first one in which no one dies. And I don't know what that means. Maybe it means I'm 70 and I should have got over all that. But when I went into therapy, it is really much more intense way of trying to recognize whatever it is that is bothering you, and to see if you could further recognize it and see it clearly, not make it into sentences, not put plot on it, not put shape on it, not see how even, you could relate it to the novels of the past. In other words, when you're working on a novel, part of your mind is fully strategic in seeing, will this work? If I put this here or there, and you can easily add not. You could say, so-and-so died in the winter. You could say, well, she died in the spring, or say, she went to Dublin on the train instead. That you could do that in a novel. In therapy, you try that with a therapist, a good therapist. No, she went to Dublin on the train. No, you've just said that you couldn't fictionalize or go all playful. And so, that was a lie. And the therapist, if he knew I had said that, he would have said, there you go again. Yeah.
Well, I never believe anything that anybody tells me in an interview. I'll just ask one more question and then we'll go over to Slido. You've written two very fine novels about two of your literary heroes, Henry James and Thomas Mann. I suppose it's no surprise, given what you're writing about in Brooklyn and Long Island, I suppose it's no surprise that both were exiles, and the American James in England and the German Mann in the US. So, in a sense, while they seem to stand apart from your other novels, thematically you can see them as similar. And Mann, you write about in New Ways to Kill Your Mother, was very unprepared for exile, whereas James might have been a bit more prepared. Is that right? Was it the fact that they were exiles, homesick, and also that they had secrets that they kept?
Yeah, I wrote a novel called The Blackwater Lightship, and it had six characters over 7 days in a small house on that coast. And it's raining outside, but inside it's filled with recrimination and rosaries and people making tea and Irish people just at each other. And it's nothing to do with history or the British or anything, it's just each other. And I thought when it was over, I will never do that again. That's finished with. No more bickering Irish people, no more Irish families, no more rain, no more recrimination, no more rosaries, no more cups of tea. Like, it's over. And I felt that very intensely. If you go on with it, what are you going to write another novel about another Irish family, more bickering? And so I thought I'd write a novel about Henry James. Honestly, the sheer relief of realizing I could go to Venice instead of looking into my own heart and thinking about, I could go to Venice and I could feel I was doing research. I could write about duchesses. I could write about rich people and famous people. I could bring in anyone. Oscar Wilde could be a character. And it was such a pleasure to be away from it until that was finished. And of course, I wrote Brooklyn, in other words. And the Thomas Mann book came in the same sort of way, where I felt I'd come to not just a dead end artistically, but a dead end emotionally, where I can't put any more emotion from all that. Even though it was fiction, I was using an awful lot of material from home. And it was infused with loss, and it was infused with all sorts of unresolved things. I thought, no more. And so Thomas Mann again, you could go to Lübeck, go to Germany on your holidays. You could go to Pacific Palisades at Los Angeles, where you went. So in both of those, I had suddenly to go back to a comfort zone, which was what I've been reading, the writers I've been thinking about, the pieces I've been writing about writers. And in both cases, James and Thomas Mann were closeted homosexuals. They lived lives of great ambiguity about everything, including, in Thomas Mann's case, politics. He was a royalist, a monarchist, and anti-democratic in 1914. And yet he became a great Democrat and a leader of the opposition against Hitler. So, I had a lot to work with, including vast numbers of letters, notebooks, diaries, all sorts of secret things now in the light. And so The advantage of writing those two books was they just left me, they gave me a holiday for myself. And it was a holiday I thought was richly deserved, and badly needed. And I needed a suntan and some sort of, regular, just nice food. And, that's what those two books provided me with. Just I didn't have to be Irish again for another few years. Yeah.
Okay. That's enough of me asking you things.
Now, Slido.
Now we're going to slide over to Slido. And I'm going to ask all the really difficult questions that have been sent in anonymously. Let's keep it reasonably... Clean and swift-ish. So I'll start with the one that... okay. Here's one that's going to test you. No, not test you. This is an anonymous one. A guest at the table incisively reviewed the last 3 popes. What are your hopes for life under Pope Leo?
How long do we have? I just say 2 things about him. That he's the same age as we are.
Yep.
And he's going to be a great role model. I don't mean as a pope, but I mean as a man. So I want to see him. He's fit. He plays tennis. I want to see him over the next decade. I hope to see him going upstairs. I'm going to watch how he's doing with steps and watch how he's doing with, does he forget people's names? Popes for me up to now have been old, getting older. And now I have this bright-eyed, reasonably fit-looking fellow, and honestly, I'm delighted with him so far. The second thing is, watch what he does next. Because in February this year, God sent a gift to the Vatican, which is that Cardinal Timothy Dolan of New York, who I found a very offensive person, who's a supporter of Trump, and Trump is a supporter of his, is 75 in February. At 75, a bishop has to give his resignation to the Vatican, which may or may not accept it. Now, I would be interested in Leo watching Dolan. Of all the fellows he needs to remove, Dolan is high. And God has given Dolan the right age. And I think Leo will move slowly. And I don't think his appointment will be controversial, but it will be a very quiet-spoken, spiritual, liberal, left-wing figure. And it will be an affront to Trump in some way, but it will be a message to the world: we're not having any more loud-mouthed Republicans as cardinals. And, the battle between Trump and Francis, we can't overestimate it. Trump began in December by appointing an ambassador to the Vatican who had written ugly things about Francis. Francis retaliated in January by accepting the resignation of the Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C., and putting in a man called McElroy, who was the Cardinal Archbishop of San Diego, in his place. McElroy, before he left San Diego, led a march of migrants against Trump, and then made his way to Washington, D.C., where he's now in place. He's a youngish man, he'll outlive us all in Washington, D.C. So the battle is already in place. And in the middle of the whole thing, I have nothing against converts. I think more people should join the one true church. but I do resent the attack chihuahua known as J.D. Vance, who only joined Holy Mother Church in 2019. I do really resent him going around the place as a Catholic and talking about being a Catholic. He's just recently a Catholic. It's like someone who was in the closet. When they come out, they're more gay than, I was going to say than the Pope, but I mean more gay than Genghis Khan or someone. But therefore, it's going to be a lot of fun watching this quiet, thoughtful missionary figure. He was a missionary in Peru. He was considered a great leader of the Augustinians. He's thoughtful. He's quiet-spoken. And maybe those 2 things are enough now for a political leader. Maybe in Australia and Canada have shown the way for having these quiet-spoken, thoughtful. If Albanese is thoughtful, I don't know, but he's quiet-spoken. But I mean, just having as many leaders as possible, certainly in Ireland, Micheál Martin, our Prime Minister, is quiet-spoken and thoughtful. That image of a man being quiet-spoken and thoughtful will in the future become a very important political thing, because we have a monster, running things in Washington.
Yep.
And he's very loud, he's very crude, and everything about him is ugly and evil. And his little sidekick, the attack Chihuahua, J.D. Vance, annoys me even more. I don't know why.
Yeah, it's a bit of a worry, because if anything happens to Trump, we'll get him. Judy wants to know if you would like to see Long Island as a film, and would you want the same cast?
Oh, seemingly Saoirse Ronan gave an interview and said, yeah, I'll be raging if they don't ask me. And so, yeah, the same producer as produced Brooklyn, who's from New Zealand, Finola Dwyer, she owns the rights. She bought the rights, and we'll see what she does. But I did sign like before. And once you sign, the film is not yours. In other words, I'm not writing the screenplay, and you don't start making a nuisance of yourself by calling up the screenwriter to say, you got to put that bit back in. And so, it's for me, it's gone. Maybe it'll be interesting if it ever appears, but I hope so, yeah.
Yeah, and hopefully Nick Hornby would do the screenplay.
No, Nick's not doing the screenplay.
Oh.
But we'll see how it goes.
Okay. Have you, and here's an anonymous one, have you ever considered writing more queer novels or characters?
Yeah. I mean, in other words, having written Long Island, you can realize that I feel shame about that too, that there should be, here is this, why am I going on about these marriages and these straight people and all their problems? And also there's something slightly evil about Long Island where the two straight men really do behave badly, and maybe that's if my psychiatrist was around, he would say, yeah, look at you. And I'm trying to start a novel where there will be all those things, mainly those things. We'll keep all straight people out of this next book.
Okay, now, how do you reflect on the extent of your personal agency in writing these novels? What do you choose and what don't you choose? That came from an anonymous person.
It's not...
No, it didn't. It came from Abby.
Oh,
sorry.
It's not strategic. In other words, you don't go, oh, now I need to write a novel in which there are gay characters, or I need to write a novel set in Italy. That something occurs to you and stays with you. So while I'm talking about writing a gay novel with gay characters, it's not that I decided that as a thing I must do. I'm making a joke basically about that, but it is that something occurred to me, and I'm trying to work with it. And I'm not sure, I've tried the opening a few times, it's not working, but I'll see. But it is almost the idea of a seed or something tiny that grows, that stays with you. No notes, take no notes, because if you can't remember, there's no use. And then it just starts to grow, and it seems the right thing to do, because it's, no matter what you're doing, you're thinking about it. So my partner says to me, what are you thinking about? Because obviously I must look really vacant or something. And I say, oh God, I'm thinking about the novel. And it would be a novel that I'm planning in the future, that I'm trying to, suddenly something has occurred to me. So really that's how agents, you have agency at a certain point, but at the beginning it comes to you and you don't quite know how. It's like the Annunciation, the angel comes with the news. It's not exactly like that, but...
Now, somebody asks, it's an observation, there seems to have been a renaissance in Irish novels. Why do you think this is? Has there indeed been a renaissance?
There are a lot of good novels being published, and there are a lot of... It's funny, in every season, some new voice emerges, and it's often a big surprise. I mean, you take, for example, County Mayo, which up to now, it's nice and it's got some nice towns, but it's pretty desolate. But it's never had anything much, really. And suddenly it gets Sally Rooney, Colin Barrett, and Mike McCormack, all three writing about this small county on the coast in the west of Ireland. And each of them creates a different County Mayo. entirely different. One of the reasons is that we don't have great symphony orchestras. Like there's no Irish Beethoven. Like we don't talk about the great Irish flowering of symphonic music, or we don't have an Irish Rembrandt. And the reason for both is we suffer so much 19th century, 18th century poverty, that the idea that you could own a French horn, I mean, just imagine a French horn in Ireland. There weren't French horns. There weren't cellos. There wasn't canvas or patrons who would buy a painting. But every house, literacy. The only way out of poverty is literacy. And every ambitious parent said to the kid, learn, if you could read and write, you could actually get an indoors job. The other thing was the proximity to London. That sounds strange because London is meant to be the sort of enemy city. But actually, London editors since about 1800 have always been really receptive to Irish novels. The weirder, the better. And it's always been a funny relationship. That's been a very close relationship between editors and writers. The editors being English in London and the writers being Irish. And oddly enough, there's always been a great relationship to readers in southern England. The very people who voted for Margaret Thatcher were actually reading your book. And it's a funny just part of southern England's culture. And so it's a funny world. Yeah, I had a friend, John McGarren, and he was an Irish novelist, and he was in London, and he said to his editor, I hear there are a lot of, now he meant this as a joke, please, I heard there are a lot of young Irish writers starting up. And the editor said, yeah, we're getting a lot of really good. And he said, I'm hoping you'll stamp this out. And, there is an element every season. Oh my God, you get, for example, the emergence of someone like Sally Rooney describing a Dublin that has actually escaped me. I'm too old. Yeah. I haven't lived like that in Dublin. And she manages to write about it, and you realize, wow, there's something new to be said.
Okay, now, on your way here, you were reading Helen Garner's diaries. What did you make of them? And what are you going to read on the plane back home?
It might seem a small matter that Helen Garner has been writing these diaries. They've come out in England and Ireland and America in a single volume of 1,000 pages. Now, what has to be said first is we do not have a diarist of that sort in Ireland. You're talking about flowering of Irish writing. It's all mask, it's all fiction, it's all, creating images. But there's no writer of that importance, or of any importance, who has, over a period of 20 years, written a diary dealing with the most searing self-examination, with the examination of relationships, with being a mother, with being a lover, with being a writer, with being a citizen, and with her relationship to the Australian landscape. We simply don't have that manuscript. Now, if you think of France, Simone de Beauvoir was so filled with herself, with every part of herself lay examined. But that went back to an 18th century tradition of not only keeping diaries, but writing them for publication. What in Oscar Wilde, what the young woman says, she keeps a diary so she can have something sensational to read on the train. And but that silence remains in Ireland, that gap between the self and the examined self and the self in print. So much is kept in reserve. So that it may seem like an ordinary thing to happen here, but having a book like that, which makes the private life into the supreme thing, but does so publicly, is actually a huge intervention in, I suppose, the creation of a sort of an idea of selfhood, of what it is like to be alive, and the sheer importance of private experience, especially in the experience of someone who's constantly saying, I am not a beautiful woman, what does that mean? Or I am a writer, what does that mean? Or I am alone, what does that mean? Or I'm in love, what does that mean? That might seem like a minor manuscript compared to, say, her novels, or compared to the novels of the other people who are named in the book with alphabet, with as Z or as Y or as B. But nonetheless, I'm reading it with a huge interest, thinking, what would it mean if someone in Ireland were to do this? What change would it make in the society. I mean, Virginia Woolf's diaries, for example, are a great example of someone just being so ready to basically examine themselves, but in a lacerating and fiercely honest way, as well as describe, an ordinary sky and in a luminous way. Anyway, I'm having a lot of, as you can imagine, what I've just said, I'm having a lot of fun with this book. And I want to write about it and think about it more because it's a new idea. And I even can't think of in contemporary United States or even in England, someone who has written about herself. And maybe someone like Joan Didion, but it's been much more literary in Joan Didion's case. And so 1,000 pages of your diary being published and everyone can read them and everywhere you go, people can look at you. I mean, think about it.
Okay, we've got one more question. You've got to be very swift with this because we're about 10 minutes. No.
I've been going on too long. I know.
We're 10 minutes over, but that's all right because we started a wee bit late.
Oh, we did.
You'll be able to answer this in just a few words. Who are the writers who have inspired? This is an anonymous question. Who are the writers who have inspired you? What are the principles you've taken from their work and attempted to apply to your own?
I read Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises when I was about 16 or 17. I just loved how smart it was. I didn't analyze it. I didn't think, oh, why is this happening like this? There are very good jokes in the book where someone goes bankrupt and someone, how did you go bankrupt? He said, well, 2 ways. First gradually, then suddenly. But it wasn't just jokes. It was the way, the attitude, the way they all went to Spain to have a good time, and the description of drinking. I mean, in Ireland, drinking is sort of shameful, dark, wintry activity. Drink, hangover. And in Hemingway, drink was pure pleasure. The idea of the body. Anyway, I just loved the book, and I didn't think I want to write like that, but it did make me think, look at this. And also the beautiful little sentences. And I know he's not fashionable now, but I still love him. And I didn't think I want to write like him. I would never have thought that. I was working as a barman in a hotel. Couldn't even do that. And I certainly thought I could. I mean, how would you publish a book?
Didn't a reviewer describe, I'm not sure if it was the South or the Heather Blazing, as Hemingway with wisdom?
David Lodge did.
Oh, your friend David Lodge.
Yeah, it was David Lodge said, Hemingway with wisdom. Oh my God, wisdom. I know the Hemingway with wisdom. No, I don't think so.
All right, on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I should say that Colm will be signing copies of many of his books, if you buy them, from the readings shop in the foyer, and he'll be upstairs in the salon. Meanwhile, please put your hands together for Colm Tóibín.
And thank you very much. Thank you.